When I walked into the courtroom that morning, they laughed. It wasn't a welcoming laugh, but that crooked smirk of people who think they've already dug your grave. Rebecca, my daughter, tilted her head slightly and whispered something to her husband. Evan gave a small shake of his head and chuckled under his breath as if life had just handed him a predictable joke. They thought I couldn't hear, but ears that have lived more than one lifetime rarely miss anything. A widowed old woman, silver hair pinned neatly, an old handbag and low-heeled shoes. They looked at me the way one looks at a yellowed page, one touch away from turning to dust. No one knew I once stood in the place they think they now own, powerful, informed, and absolutely convinced of victory. I stood in the cold light of the Boston Superior Court air conditioning, brushing my neck, the scent of paper and metal echoing like the weary breath of ancient justice. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from holding back the one thing stronger than pain, the truth. They believed today would be the day I broke, that I'd cry, collapse, beg for mercy. They were only wrong about one thing. I didn't come here to be pitied. I came to remind them that even women who've stepped out of the spotlight still have days when they return, not to ask for a seat, but to reclaim the place that was always theirs. Their crusty assumptions were about to crack piece by piece. Boston Superior Court always has a distinct smell, like old paper mixed with leather seats and a cold hint of steel from the metal rails. The air is heavy, still, and solemn, as if every wall remembers the scrutiny of hundreds of lives. I stepped into the grand hall, the dry sound of my shoes tapping against the stone floor echoing like the calm heartbeat I was trying to hold steady. The white overhead light beamed down like surgical lamps, bright, unforgiving, exposing every wrinkle, every breath. The cold air snuck past my collar, making the skin on my arms contract. My hand trembled slightly, but I gripped the strap of my cloth bag tightly. Not from fear, but to anchor myself upright, steady, clear, 1 second at a time. I didn't come in designer clothes or with a glossy leather purse. I came as I am now, a 67-year-old widow, in a charcoal knit coat, hair tied back neatly, carrying the same old fabric bag I use for grocery shopping, still faintly minty from the candies in the small pocket. I had nothing to flaunt. They thought I had nothing left to flaunt. They thought I was empty. It was laughable. And it hurt. Rebecca sat on the plaintiff's side, sharp in slim high heels and a fitted blazer dress, like the archetype of a busy city woman, makeup light but enough to mask the tiredness in her eyes. Beside her was Evan, tight-tied hair slicked back, face clean, like someone fresh from an executive interview. To the casual observer, they looked like a successful couple waiting for their lawyer to pitch a real estate deal. No one would guess they were here to strip their own mother of her legal capacity. When Rebecca saw me, she turned slightly to Evan, her lips curled into a strange smile, half pity, half disdain. Evan nodded subtly, his eyes scanning over me like inspecting a worn-out object. I didn't need to hear them speak to know what they meant. She's done. A sentence unspoken, but loud in the air like steel scratching glass. Those words weighed on my chest, but they also sparked something crystal clear inside me. Not rage, something deeper, pain sharpened into clarity. I walked to the defendant's row, each step steady, soft, deliberate. I could feel the tremble in my fingertips, but no one would see me falter. I placed my bag down on the bench, exhaled slowly, and lifted my chin. I looked straight at them. I didn't look away. I didn't need to. There was nothing left to avoid. The courtroom buzzed with activity. Papers, laptops, quiet consultations, chairs scraping, dry steps on tile.
Yet to me, the space felt frozen in time. I remembered the years when I stood in other courtrooms, navy suit, long hair pulled back, presenting sharp arguments to protect someone from injustice. Someone once looked at me with admiration. Now the one looking at me was my daughter, and there was no love in that gaze. Rebecca held a Starbucks cup, her nude painted nails elegant. She turned the cup slowly, as if she had all the time and confidence in the world. Evan pressed his lips together, reviewing documents, like revisiting a game plan before finishing off a weakened opponent. They didn't know I once stood in that exact position years ago, only I never saw a family member as an opponent to be defeated. A frail woman behind me coughed a long, tired sound. I turned to her, offered a soft smile, then faced forward again. That moment reminded me I wasn't the only one carrying pain in this room. But my pain had a name, a face, a voice. I used to sing to sleep, walk to preschool, braid every morning. My pain was named Rebecca. The courtroom doors opened. A court officer entered, his voice commanding everyone to take their places. Chairs shifted, papers folded. I took one more deep breath. There was no exit now, and none needed. I stood when instructed, head held high, not in pride, but in dignity. Someone once taught me, dignity is the last thing a person is allowed to lose. Thomas told me that in 1988, when he held my hand after I won my first trial, that man believed in me to his final breath, and I will not betray that belief. Rebecca glanced my way, and for a split second, something flickered in her eyes, but it vanished behind pride. For a brief moment, she looked like a child in shoes too big for her. A flicker of sympathy pierced my chest, but it lasted only one heartbeat before shattering. Because sympathy saves no one when greed has already taken over. Evan placed his hand on Rebecca's back, a gesture of comfort or control I couldn't tell. He whispered something into my daughter's ear, and they both turned to look at me again. I heard them laugh softly, not loud enough to draw attention, just enough to cut a thin line across my heart. Thin, but sharp. I said nothing. I didn't lower my head in search of calm. I simply stood there, looked at them, gaze steady and composed. Because I was ready for this. I've lived long enough to know some battles don't need screams. Only silence and truth will handle the rest. But I still had to walk through this, feeling the one where your own child sees you as a burden, a project to resolve, a bank account to seize. That feeling is colder than the air conditioning, sharper than the white light above. I closed my eyes for a second, opened them slowly. No tears, only a silent fire steady and strong as steel. They thought today would be the day I broke. I knew that. Everyone in this room knew that. But they forgot one simple thing. People who've stood alone in life don't break easily. Their hands may tremble, but they don't fall. They may be silent, but they don't surrender. I tightened my grip on my bag, my heartbeat steady. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer had space in this story. I stepped closer to my table, sat down, eyes still facing forward. And in that moment, I heard my own thoughts clear as a whisper, soft but sharp. They think today is the day I fall. I gently turned my wedding ring on my finger, the cool metal pressing against my skin. But they don't know I've stood back up from places darker than this. No revenge needed, no show of strength, just standing and proving. Not every old person is weak. Not everyone silent is resigned. And family isn't always right just because they share your blood. I took one last deep breath before the judge entered. My whole body stilled like a lake before a storm. If they wanted to see me break, they would have to wait much longer. Much, much longer. 6 months ago, I stood beside the stark white hospital bed in the intensive care unit at Brigham and Women's Hospital. The dim yellow light above cast everything in a tired gray hue, as if even the light was afraid to disturb those clinging to the final moments with someone they loved. The ventilator pulsed steadily, the beeping monitor rang out slow and sparse, then picked up as Thomas's heartbeat weakened. His eyes were half closed, breath fragile, like the faint scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. I held his hand, once strong enough to pull suitcases through long travels, once steady enough to hold me up when I trembled walking into the delivery room to have Rebecca. Now it was cold and weightless, like a thin sheet of paper. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at me for a long time, as if gathering every last image of me into memory. He whispered, his voice slipping past dry lips like a late-season breeze. "Keep everything. Don't trust blindly." His breath broke apart in a heavy sigh. The words weren't loud, but they landed inside me like a fine blade. I wanted to tell him not to say such things, that no one would try to take anything from me, that family was still the safest place. But I couldn't lie to Thomas, not now. He always saw through people, especially those he loved. And somewhere deep inside, I already knew he was right. I just didn't want to believe it. I placed my hand over his, brought it to my cheek, feeling the last bit of warmth slowly leaving. The doctor entered with a sorrowful nod, removed the IV, and the nurse adjusted the machines. I knew what that meant. Thomas opened his eyes once more, tried to smile, though it was only the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. "You'll be fine," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. I nodded gently, even though I wasn't sure at all. When his final breath left his body, the room seemed to fall into a vacuum. Not because sound disappeared, but because something inside me shattered in complete silence. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just sat there, feeling like someone had cut the last thread holding me to the world. I left his hand resting on his chest, where a heart once beat hard for love, for joy, for the endless Boston winters that somehow felt warm because we had each other. The funeral took place a few days later beneath the gray autumn sky of New England. Rows of blazing red maples stood tall, like they were bidding farewell to an old friend. The wind hissed through the leaves, the rustling underfoot like whispers from hundreds of souls offering condolences. I stood before the dark coffin, a wool scarf wrapped around my neck, hands trembling, whether from cold or grief I couldn't tell. Rebecca leaned into Evan, her eyes red but lips tight as if holding the pain inside through silence. Evan placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes not on the coffin, but drifting off, distracted, like a man running calculations in his head. I told myself not to think that way, that my son-in-law couldn't be so cold. But human hearts are unpredictable, and I'd lived long enough not to trust appearances. The priest read the final rites, his voice deep and steady, but all I could hear was the wind dragging itself across the wide cemetery. A maple leaf landed at my feet, touched my shoe, and rolled away with a gust. Old friends came to hug me, offered their words of sympathy, but I only saw their lips move. I couldn't make out the meaning. The world seemed to fade, to blur, everything drifting in a thin fog of grief. After the burial, people slowly left, and I stood alone by the fresh mound of earth, dark, damp, still carrying the scent of last night's rain. I bent down, placed a white rose on the grave. My eyes didn't shed a single tear, but my chest felt like it was being crushed. I whispered, "I'll keep everything, Thomas," though I wasn't sure whether I was promising him or trying to convince myself. That night, I came home to the house we had shared for decades. The living room light was still on. Thomas's armchair still had the back pillow, his book unfinished on the side table. There was no sound from the TV, no voice calling to me from the kitchen, no clink of spoons stirring tea. I hung up my coat, stepped into the living room, and stood there for a long time. The silence was too thick, as if the walls were holding back every sound. I lit the fireplace. The small flame sparked, danced against the glass, but the room remained cold, so cold. I poured tea, my hands trembling as I lifted the pot, not from the weather, but from not being used to pouring just one cup. Sitting down, I cupped the warm mug with both hands, pressed it lightly to my cheek. The warmth spread, but it wasn't enough to heat the space inside me. I stared at the fire, the flame reflecting in my eyes, and still no tears came. The sorrow of old age is not like the sorrow of youth. It doesn't explode. It doesn't break open. It seeps into the blood, into every breath, into the spaces between your fingers. The house was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the clock, each second heavy. I tried to close my eyes, but when I did, I saw Thomas smiling on our wedding day, pouring tea for me in the morning, placing his hand on my shoulder while I worked in the garden. Each memory was like a shard of glass, beautiful but cutting. I opened my eyes and took a deep breath. People say crying helps you release pain, but some grief doesn't find its way out through tears. It just sits there in your chest, heavy as stone. On the first day without Thomas, I didn't turn on the TV, didn't play music. I just sat there, listening to the silence grow louder, swallowing the room whole. That night, I went to bed, a large bed with soft cotton sheets like always, but the pillow beside me was still flat, still cold, and still empty. I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, not because I feared the dark, but because I feared the morning. Morning meant another day without him. There are moments in life when you feel caught between two shores, one of memory and one of a hollow future. I lay there in between, not knowing which side to step toward. No one teaches you how to live when the one you love most is gone. Youth teaches us how to begin. Old age forces us to learn how to let go, and sometimes that lesson is crueler than any exam. I remember Thomas once said, "We'll grow old, and one of us will have to sit and watch the fire die out." I thought he was joking, but now I know it wasn't a sad line. It was the soft truth of those who have loved long enough. We never argued over who would go first, who would stay. Because no one wins in the final goodbye. I sat up, walked to the window, and drew the curtain. Outside, the streetlight shone over fallen yellow leaves on the sidewalk. The wind stirred the bare branches gently. The city still lived, still breathed, but inside my home, time stood still. One person gone, and the world shrinks instantly. I touched the window frame, cold and smooth. "I'll be fine," I repeated Thomas's words to myself, but my voice was thin like a fraying thread. No tears fell. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because sometimes when pain runs too deep, tears can't find their way out. That night, I sat until the sky began to lighten. The first faint light crept through the window, touching the photo frames on the shelf. One showed us standing by the sea at Cape Cod, his arm around me, sunlight in his eyes. I gently touched the frame, and for the first time since he left, I softly whispered, "I'm still here," like a late reply to his final words. Then I poured more tea, lifted the cup with both hands, and began the new morning, the first morning of a life alone. No laughter, no footsteps, just the firelight, the ticking clock, and a heart learning how to beat again in the emptiness. No tears, just stillness, like a shadowed corner of an old cathedral where no one begs for miracles, only learns how to live with absence. And I sat there in that silent house, growing older by a little, just in one night. A few weeks after the funeral, the Boston wind still swept through the old streets of Beacon Hill, rustling along red brick sidewalks and cast iron railings. I remember that morning vividly, not because of the weather, but because of the feeling inside me. A fragile calm, like a still lake just before the first breeze stirs its surface. I wasn't expecting much from the will reading. Thomas had always been clear about everything, and we had talked through it all long before. But what I hadn't anticipated was how the people I loved would react. The lawyer's office was in an old building in Beacon Hill with high ceilings paneled in dark oak and large glass windows overlooking rows of bare trees. Inside, the scent of old wood and paperwork created a solemn atmosphere, something aged and firm, as if this place had borne witness to hundreds of decisions that changed people's lives. Harold Chambers Thomas's longtime friend and attorney stood to shake my hand. His voice was low and soft, still carrying a trace of grief. "Eleanor, my condolences once again," he said, then turned to Rebecca and Evan. "Thank you both for coming." Rebecca nodded, attempting a gentle smile, but her eyes betrayed an anxious anticipation. Evan sat beside her, fingers interlaced, posture like someone attending a high-stakes meeting. Both were dressed in formal black, even though the funeral had passed weeks ago, as if to remind the world they were still in mourning. Or perhaps they believed that appearance would make them seem more proper. I chose a seat near the window where the light fell across the sleeve of my sweater, casting alternating patches of brightness and shadow. The morning light was cold, as if the sun was determined to expose every hidden corner without offering any warmth. Harold opened the folder in front of him, inhaling like a man preparing for something significant. He began reading in formal tones, and when Thomas's name echoed through the room, it tightened something in my chest. I placed my hands on my knees, keeping my breathing steady. Then came the most important line, plain, direct, without embellishment. The entirety of the estate, including real property investments, bank accounts, and other related assets, shall be transferred to my lawful wife, Eleanor Hayes. The sound of a pen dropping on the table rang out sharply, cutting through the tense silence. Rebecca stared at Harold as if he had just made a terrible mistake. Her hand trembled slightly, lips pressed into a tight line. Evan immediately placed his hand over hers, giving a light squeeze, but his gaze turned to me, cold like glass beneath water. I said nothing. There was no reason to speak. I had known Thomas's wishes for a long time. But the way they looked at me in that moment made it feel like I had taken something that didn't belong to me, not because I felt guilty, but because I clearly saw what Thomas had once warned me about, a shadow behind the family smile, greed. Rebecca tried to speak, but her voice cracked like glass, I thought. Dad had said something too. I mean, you never really handled the finances before. Harold looked up, his face serious. Thomas was very firm in this decision. He told me clearly many times. Evan jumped in, his tone polite but razor sharp. Did he give a reason? Because from a practical standpoint, Eleanor, she's never personally managed the family's finances. I turned to look at Evan. His eyes didn't flinch, but there was no compassion in them, only calculation, like someone analyzing a spreadsheet. I could almost see the numbers running through his mind, fast and sharp like steel blades. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice low but edged with anger. "Mom, I don't understand. Dad said he would leave something for us. I didn't think this was fair." I looked at my daughter, the same girl I once held in my arms when she cried after falling off her bike, the one I stayed up through the night for, cooling her fever, the one whose hair I brushed each morning before school. And now she sat there, her eyes glistening, not with sorrow, but with the sting of broken expectations. I spoke slowly, each word clear and steady, like threads I was trying to smooth. Your father trusted me more than anyone. Rebecca opened her mouth, ready to argue, but nothing came out. Evan tilted his head slightly, reassessing me, as if recalculating the variables. In that moment, I was no longer just the aging mother-in-law he had dismissed. I was the one holding power. And to men like Evan, power was never a burden, it was a prize to claim. Harold continued reading the terms, but I no longer heard the words. All I could make out was the ticking of a hallway clock, each tick thudding into my chest. I could feel something shifting in the room, a current pulling quietly but forcefully toward ambition. When the reading ended, Harold looked at me with sympathy, then turned to Rebecca. If you need more time to understand your father's wishes, we can arrange another meeting to go over everything in detail. Rebecca's expression stiffened, unclear whether she wanted to thank him or break down. She stood too quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Evan placed his hand on her back as if guiding her, but I saw it for what it was, not comfort, but pressure, a push steering her in his chosen direction. Rebecca turned to me, her eyes red, voice small and choked. Mom, why did Dad choose this? Why didn't he trust me? I looked at her, my heart aching, though no tears came. Thomas believed the one who safeguards something precious should be the one who understands its meaning the most. Meaning, she repeated, voice cracking. This is a family estate, not a keepsake. Evan tightened his grip on her shoulder, drawing her back slightly, then said, "We should go. We'll revisit this later." The oak door closed behind them, leaving the room steeped in heavy silence. Harold sighed quietly. Thomas told me this day would come. He hoped it would be gentler than this. I nodded, gripping the strap of my bag. I hoped so too. I stepped out of the office into the cold Boston noon sunlight, trying to break through the trees. Red maple leaves drifted and spun in the air like unanswered questions. The wind carried the scent of wood and damp earth, reminding me that seasons were changing, and so were the people. As I walked down the steps, I felt the ground beneath me subtly shift. Not because I had lost my footing, but because I now understood that the road ahead would not be straight and certainly not smooth. My daughter had left not as someone grieving, but as someone who had been denied power. And my son-in-law, his eyes had said everything. A silent war had just begun. I stood on the sidewalk for a long while watching the cars pass along Charles Street. The distant sound of horns, tires rolling over wet asphalt, wind slipping through old rooftops. It all blended into a slow, low, weighty song. I tucked my hands into my coat pockets, pulled my scarf up higher. There was an emptiness in my chest then, not peace, but a hollow space that kinship could no longer fill. I walked on slowly, unhurried, but within me a door had just closed. And another, heavy but inevitable, was beginning to open. I didn't know what lay behind it, but I knew I would not turn back. Not because I wanted to win, but because I refused to lose what Thomas left me, his belief that I was strong enough to stand alone. Under the pale sun and crisp wind of Beacon Hill, I whispered a line only I could hear. "You were right, Thomas. They're not letting go." And the wind carried that truth away, mingling with the red leaves drifting softly across the old city sidewalks. In the days following the will reading, my life drifted by like a Massachusetts winter lake, still on the surface, but beneath cold currents moved silently. At first, I believed the distance between Rebecca and me would soften over time, but sometimes time doesn't heal, it only clarifies what had already fractured long ago. Rebecca started calling me every day. not to ask what I'd eaten, whether I'd slept well, or how cold Boston's weather was that day. Her calls always opened with a simple question, sharp like a needle. "Mom, did you check the account yet? Or can you send me the bank login so I can help monitor your spending for safety?" The first time I heard it, I tried to smile, tried to understand, tried to believe it was just a daughter concerned for her aging mother. But by the third day, the fifth, and eventually nearly every day, her voice held no warmth, only the urgency of someone waiting for access. That's when I began to feel breathless. "Rebecca," I said one afternoon when she texted me again asking for the password, "I've been paying my own bills my whole life." "I know," she replied, her voice sweet as if sugarcoating a cut, "but you're living alone now. I just want to make sure no one takes advantage of you, or that you don't accidentally click the wrong thing. I don't want you to stress." I stared at the phone until the screen went dark. I'd heard that sentence 1,000 times in America, woven into stories about elders being placed in care homes or having guardianship taken by their children. "I don't want you to stress" sounded like love, but smelled of control. Sometimes care isn't an umbrella from the sun. Sometimes it's a lock on the door. Evan was subtler, or at least he thought so. One Sunday morning, I received an email from him titled "Options for Future Comfort." A list of links appeared, assisted living facilities around Boston, all sleek and polished with gyms, yoga rooms, heated pools, and professional staff. I read through each line. The marketing phrases, "soft as down pillows," "a safe place for independent seniors who need light support," "a friendly environment with peers of the same generation," "peaceful retirement living." If I hadn't just buried my husband, I might have mistaken it for a thoughtful gesture. But when I read Evan's final line, "Living alone is unsafe, and I think this would be a good option for you before anything happens," my heart flipped. Before anything happens, as if disaster were a given and I was just delaying the collapse. I closed the email and sat still for a long time at the window. The Boston sky was blue that day, sunlight casting golden light on red brick walls outside, reflecting off the old glass windows. The streets were calm, people walking dogs, children playing in mittens, the green bus stopping at its usual corner. Everything looked normal enough to hurt. But my life was being peeled away in thin slices like layers of an onion. No tears in my eyes, but something stung deeper. On another day, I went to the neighborhood CVS pharmacy to buy supplements and a few small things. I liked walking there. Each step on the stone sidewalk reminded me I still had control. I picked out a bottle of vitamins, a few packets of chamomile tea hand cream, and stood in line behind an older woman asking the pharmacist how to use a blood pressure monitor. That moment comforted me. For a few minutes, I wasn't the only one living slowly. I handed over my card to pay. The POS screen lit up with a message from the bank: "Fraud alert, recent unusual activity, account temporarily paused." I stood still. A few people behind me shuffled their feet, waiting. The cashier looked at me politely but awkwardly. "Do you have another card, ma'am?" I pulled out my phone, opened the banking app. A notification popped up from Rebecca. "Mom, I locked your card just to be safe. I saw some unexpected charges. I'll unlock it once I verify." That receipt was only $32, vitamins and tea. I felt like I just had my bag searched at airport security, as if I were a suspect. The worst part wasn't the declined payment. It was the feeling of being watched, as if I were no longer a person, but a target to be managed. I paid in cash and walked out of CVS, the wind blowing my hair from its clip. Late-season maple leaves scattered across the sidewalk, and I heard my own shoes tapping the brick like the breath of someone trying to stand tall after being pushed down. The sky had turned gray, and I wondered, when did love become a hand on my back, pushing me step by step into a world where I no longer got to decide for myself. That evening, Rebecca called. I heard the microwave humming in the background, the sound of a mug clinking against the counter, the sounds of a home with dinner, with company. My house, in contrast, was as quiet as an old library. "Mom, did you get the notification?" she asked, voice light but not soft. "I only locked your card temporarily. Just let me know each time you need something, okay?" I kept my tone even. "I just bought vitamins and tea. You really shouldn't go that far alone. You might slip. And spending should be monitored. We have to be careful, you understand?" There are moments when no one yells, no one insults you, but the invisible grip of power and condescension tightens around you just the same. I closed my eyes and pictured Thomas's hand holding mine in his final hours, a warm, trusting hand, not one that tried to control. I took a long breath. "Rebecca," I said slowly, each word like a blade drawn from a wound, "when did love become control?" Silence on the other end. A silence hard to define, like someone who no longer understood the question because they had wandered too far from where they began. Then Rebecca sighed, tired but unyielding. "Mom, I'm doing this for you." You have to understand that. But I understood exactly what I was hearing. It wasn't love. It was something that had quietly taken root long ago, the belief that they knew what was best for me, even when that meant stripping away my choices. I hung up before my voice could tremble, set the phone down. My chest felt as heavy as a stone resting at the bottom of a lake. No one else stood in my home, yet I had never felt so closely watched. There were no cameras, but still, unseen eyes followed me. I sat on the sofa looking out at the small, dark garden beyond the window. The lavender Thomas planted still stood dry but resilient through winter. I reached for the knit blanket draped over the arm of the chair. The coarse fabric beneath my fingers reminded me of his warmth. I whispered to no one in particular, so Thomas was right. The words faded into the still room like breath leaving the chest of someone struggling to stay upright. I hadn't broken, but I knew I'd just stepped across a new line in my life. Not the line between old and young, strong and weak, but between being the owner of my life and being someone others believed they should own for me. In that night's quiet, a feeling slowly rose, not anger, not rebellion. Just a small vow, clear and steady like a compass in the hand of an old sailor. No one gets to take away my right to be myself, not while I'm still breathing. And I sat there in that silent house, back straight, eyes fixed on the black sky ahead, knowing that this fight had only just begun. I wasn't yet the one who had reclaimed her power, but I was now the one who saw it slipping away. And that is always the first moment of freedom. There are mornings in Boston so peaceful that you believe life can no longer hurt you. I remember that morning as clearly as the first sunlight shining on the kitchen table, filtering through the large window and settling on a thin layer of dust I hadn't yet wiped away. The sky was clear, the breeze gentle, the last maple leaves on the street trembling slightly as if waving to passers-by. I made tea, the scent of Earl Grey filling the room, the rising steam blurring the air like remnants of breath from years of happiness. Then came the knock. Not the kind of knock from a neighbor borrowing salt or checking in, but 3 firm, even, and slightly cold knocks. I opened the door. Standing before me was a young man in a FedEx uniform, his purple cap pulled low, offering a polite but strained smile, like someone delivering something they shouldn't. "I have documents that need a signature for Mrs. Hayes," he said. I signed my hand, slightly trembling with the sudden sense that the air had shifted. He placed a large yellow envelope in my hand, unusually heavy, as if it held a storm inside. When the door shut behind him, the house returned to silence, not the peaceful kind, but the silence of a wild animal sensing danger in the brush. I stood in the kitchen sunlight, now too bright, casting a spotlight on the envelope like an open wound. In the top corner, the seal of the Massachusetts Superior Court was clearly visible. I took a deep breath, but as my fingers touched the edge of the paper, my chest tightened, like someone was pulling an invisible ribbon around my ribs. I opened the envelope, each rustling page like the sound of a blade sliding through silk. As I read the first line, my hands trembled harder, and I had to set down my teacup to keep from spilling it. Petition for guardianship. My name appeared below the word respondent. The petitioners Rebecca Hayes and Evan Carter. I swallowed a dry gulp of air and tapped reading. The words were swift and cold like clean cuts. Incompetent, signs of cognitive decline, vulnerable to fraud, incapable of managing personal finances, exhibits confusion, forgetfulness, each line a blade striking directly at the memories I'd fought to protect. Not because I feared being seen as old or weak, but because my daughter, the one I had raised with love and gave the best years of my youth to, had signed her name affirming them all. I didn't sit down. I stood frozen in the kitchen, my hand gripping the edge of the counter like someone receiving devastating news. The sunlight was still there, but now it stung. I could hear the ticking of the clock, each sound striking like a hammer against steel. The kitchen had once been where Thomas and I joked about cooking. He would stand behind me, arms around my waist, and ask, "What's the chef making today?" Now, this place bore witness to something else, the truth that sometimes the one who wounds you is the one you once carried through storms. I held the pages and walked to the front hallway. Next to the mailbox was a fresh pile of flyers ads for yoga classes, supermarket discounts, and among them, one slim brochure for a luxury nursing home featuring smiling elderly people against gleaming windows. It lay casually as if waiting to be used, a cruel reminder. My hand trembled again, and this time not from age. I picked it up, staring at the image of an older woman smiling beside a piano, a man lifting a teacup with sunlight reflecting off polished windows. They looked happy, but ads always do. I placed the flyer down slowly, heavily, then leaned back against the wall. Rebecca had once held my hand as a little girl and asked, "Mom, am I the most important person to you?" I had laughed, cupped her cheek, and said, "Of course you are." I believed that answer would always be true. But life has a way of saving its hardest tests for when our shoulders are tired and our hearts are worn. I walked into the living room, placed the envelope on the table, and sat on the sofa. No lights, no music, no calls, not even a heavy sigh. Just the faint crackle of wood from the fireplace that hadn't fully burned out from the night before. In the stillness, I heard Thomas's voice like winter wind brushing the windows. Don't trust blindly. I reached for the chair where he used to read, where his hand once touched mine, and I closed my eyes. I felt pain, but it didn't spill over as tears. It tightened, coiled deep in my chest like a pebble dropped into a well. Still, heavy, hard to lift. I wanted to call Rebecca, to ask her one simple question. Did you do this to protect me or to own me? But I knew I wouldn't get the answer I needed. Greed never calls itself greed. It disguises itself as care, as what's best for you, as I just want you to be safe. I opened my eyes. My hands rested in my lap, trembling slightly, but not weak. No, Eleanor, you've weathered worse. I told myself that, not as comfort, but as confirmation. I had survived cold hospitals, empty beds, nights with only one warm pillow. I had stood beside the grave of the person I loved most. A petition could not break me. It could only wake me up. I looked up at the ceiling and took a deep breath. The air wasn't any warmer, but I felt life returning to my veins, not anger, but awareness, clear and solid as forged steel. They say betrayal never comes from strangers. I believe that, and this morning turned those words into bone and blood. I stood up, adjusted the wool scarf around my neck, and walked to the window. Outside, a bus passed. Maple leaves blew in the wind like fragments of memory. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this much. I would not be led like an old sheep. If they thought that envelope would make me bow, they picked the wrong woman. I was no longer the one who collapsed in the hospital 6 months ago. I still hurt, but I stood. And sometimes standing up is the beginning of the quietest but fiercest fight of one's life. I turned back to the envelope on the table. It no longer looked like a sentence. It looked like an invitation to step into the ring. And I had never walked away from a battle I knew I could win with clarity, not with tears. In that silence, I heard my heart speak clearly. No one gets to decide for you. Not while you still know who you are. And I stood there for a moment longer, looking out toward the long road ahead, not afraid of the darkness, because sometimes it's the darkness that teaches us to see with our hearts, not just our eyes. I would fight, not to reclaim assets, but to reclaim the right to be me. The door had opened, and this time I stepped through it upright, head unbowed. That night, I didn't turn on the ceiling light. I had always preferred the warm yellow glow of the old table lamp Thomas once repaired for me. It didn't just illuminate, it embraced the room like the arms of someone now gone. The house was quiet, the only sound the steady ticking of the clock, like an old but resilient heart that keeps beating even as storms roll in. On the table, I placed a thick, dark, leather-bound book, one of the old law books from my Harvard days. It still carried the scent of aged paper and ink, but to me, it had never grown old. I brushed my knuckles lightly along the spine, feeling every fiber of the paper, every etched letter, as though they were waking a part of me I had let sleep for too long. "I'm not a lawyer anymore," I had once told Thomas 28 years ago as I shelved that book. "I just want to be your wife and a mother." He smiled and said, "That strength doesn't disappear. It only lies in wait until it's needed." Now it was awake. I opened the book and memory poured out with the scent. The pages were softly yellowed, and the sound of each turn was like a wool coat sweeping across a hardwood floor. I began reading again, laws on guardianship, legal capacity, property rights, and procedures for appeal. Each line was a spark landing on the slow-burning embers within me, stirring warmth, clarity, and finally flame. No tears. The pain had passed. What remained was focus. I reached for a notepad, writing slowly, one sentence at a time, my hand steady. Capacity evaluation cannot be based solely on age. Evidence must include medical certification. Family is not a legal authority by default. The legal phrases returned like old friends knocking at the door after a long absence. An old woman sitting in a quiet room, clutching a thick law book, it might seem unremarkable. But I knew, and anyone who's ever fought for the right to be seen as fully human knows this was not a moment of weakness. This was preparation. As the clock neared midnight, I picked up my phone and scrolled through the contact list to a name I hadn't called in nearly 3 decades, Marion Cole. Not saved as Judge Cole, just Marion, the way we used to call each other when we were 2 young women standing under the trees of Harvard Yard, believing women could do anything, even when the world did not. I dialed. The phone rang 3 times before an older voice, sharp as a blade slicing glass, answered. Cole speaking. Marian, I said, calm but respectful, it's Eleanor. A pause. Not long, but long enough for the years between us to slip into the silence. Eleanor Hayes, she replied, not a question, but a confirmation tinged with half surprise, half memory. I've heard you've been quiet a long time. I've been quiet, I said, not gone. The last time you called me, Marianne said, was to send me a photo of Molly as a newborn. I smiled softly. It didn't hurt anymore. I'm not calling to ask for help. I want to ask about procedure, court updates, and how to defend my rights by the law. Her voice slowed, like someone examining an old sword and finding it still gleaming. You're not letting them drag you down, are you? No, I said, eyes on the golden light pooling on the edge of my book. I'm just old, not weak. I can't take sides, she reminded me. The standard code of someone who's worn a black robe and sat on the bench all her life. But I can say this. No one has the right to decide your life for you if you are still clear-minded enough to defend it. Her voice softened slightly before ending, Eleanor, welcome back. I hung up. No soundtrack, no fireworks. Just the wind slipping through the cracks of my Boston home, sharp and salty, announcing that winter had not yet left. But inside me, winter had begun to thaw. I heard the front door open gently, small, quick footsteps, then a clear voice at the end of the hallway. Grandma, I saw Molly standing there, holding a bag of homemade cookies, her hair in a messy bun, canvas shoes dusted with snow. She looked at me, not like anyone else in this family. No suspicion, no hidden intent, only real concern. Mom said you weren't feeling well, she said softly, setting the bag down and walking toward me. Are you okay, Grandma? I looked into her eyes, the same eyes I once saw in the mirror when Rebecca was little, blue, deep, and bright. But now they held something Rebecca had lost trust. I placed my hand over hers, warm and soft, like the handkerchiefs I used to embroider. Grandma's okay. She studied me for a second longer, her brow slightly furrowed, as if trying to read between the lines. You look strong, she whispered, a light smile spreading across her face. I know you're not easy to knock down. I laughed, the first real laugh in weeks. I'm just old, Molly, not weak. She leaned her head against my shoulder, the scent of youth and warm cookies blending with old paper and Earl Grey. 2 generations, 2 rhythms, 1 bloodline. I felt her heartbeat quick, restless, ready for life, and mine steady, grounded, ready to face it. I believe in you, Grandma, Molly whispered. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. A small sentence, but it held me up stronger than any statue ever could. Outside, the wind still howled. But in the room, the golden lamp lit the open law book like spring sunlight peeking through early clouds. Night had not passed. The battle had not yet begun in black ink on white paper. But I had returned. Not with loud fury, but with the quiet strength of someone who has weathered storms and still stands. In that thickening darkness, one sentence echoed within me as clear as a judge's gavel opening court. No one drives my life but me. And from that moment, everything began to shift. That morning, I chose to wear a charcoal wool dress, a long wool coat, and the pair of low round-toed shoes Thomas used to jokingly call the shoes of a woman who's walked through life instead of chasing after it. I didn't opt for heavy makeup or a fancy hairstyle. I simply brushed my hair neatly and put on a light shade of lipstick, not to impress anyone, but so they would continue believing what they wanted to believe. A simple old woman, easy to deceive, someone who doesn't understand finances. Boston was still cold mist clinging to the window of the taxi I took to the courthouse. I sat with my back straight, hands resting gently on my bag, my heart still as the Charles River before dawn. I had read the law, I had spoken to Marianne, I had rehearsed questions every night like a gardener inspecting each root after a storm. But the most important thing I carried wasn't knowledge, it was composure. When I stepped into the courtroom, the sound of my shoes on the stone floor echoed softly, clean, and deliberate, each step like a quiet drum announcing a battle that needed no war cry. Rebecca and Evan were already seated in the well-lit corner of the room, polished and poised like two expensive dolls in a wealthy family's display case. They didn't look at me. They stared forward, as if I were just a shadow passing by. I saw Rebecca press her lips together, Evan leaning slightly, his face tense like a tightened string. Their lawyer, Harold Pierce, stood near the plaintiff's table. He was tall, salt and pepper hair, gold-rimmed glasses, wearing a three-piece suit, the kind of man Boston loves to invite to speak about your family's secure financial future. But his eyes had the air of someone who stands at a pulpit believing power lives on the tip of a well-practiced tongue. When the judge entered the room, rose, then sat again at her signal. The air was cold, formal, stern, like a gust of wind sweeping through a New England field in winter. "Plaintiff, proceed," the judge said. Harold stepped forward, half a smile on his lips, full of confidence. "Your Honor, today we are here to address a deeply concerning matter." He spoke in a smooth voice, like sugar dusted on the edge of a blade. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, though, once capable, now displays significant cognitive decline. Forgetfulness, financial confusion, susceptibility to manipulation. Her family, he glanced at Rebecca for a second, only wants to protect her. I listened as each word dropped into my ears like needles into water, silent but sharp and cold. He read out a list of symptoms built from half-truths and embellishments. She called the bank 3 times to confirm her balance. She asked how to make a wire transfer. She purchased duplicate groceries. She forgot a scheduled meeting with her daughter. Each point was delivered slowly, as if painting a picture of a sweet but muddled old woman lost in the modern world, harmless but dangerous to herself, a person who should be guided. I didn't react. No frown, no flicker of emotion. I simply listened, hands resting on my lap, back straight, eyes fixed on the speaker. I let them build their stage. The higher the stage, the harder the fall. When Harold finished, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Hayes, would you like to respond?" I stood. The floor beneath my feet felt as solid as the old granite of Boston. I didn't speak right away. I took a small sip of water and set the glass down. Then I looked directly at the judge and spoke my voice low, clear, and calm. "Your Honor, under Massachusetts civil law, the purpose of guardianship is to protect those who are no longer capable of caring for themselves. It is not meant to strip autonomy from a competent adult based on age or family disagreements." From Rebecca's side, a chair scraped softly. Harold squinted slightly. I continued. Chapter 190B, Article 5, Section 5-101. The court requires clear and convincing evidence of incapacity. Medical evaluations, expert assessments, and factual evidence of behavior that endangers the individual in question. I paused, letting silence settle. In that quiet, I heard Rebecca's breath catch short and sharp, the sound of someone watching a certainty unravel. I didn't look at my daughter. I kept my gaze forward. I asked, where is the medical evaluation? Where is the doctor's report? Where is the proof I've been defrauded? Where is the record of dangerous behavior? No one answered. And no one laughed. I bowed my head slightly, then delivered the final line. I don't need anyone managing my life when my mind is still clearer than their fear. No shouting, no trembling, just truth standing tall. Harold tried to respond, but the first words out of his mouth stumbled over his own breath. Your Honor, we have family testimony, and the judge raised an eyebrow, voice cold as steel. Emotional testimony is not evidence of incapacity. Rebecca gripped Evan's hand under the table. I saw her shoulders jolt, leaning slightly back. Evan stared at me as if he couldn't understand how someone his senior could stand steady before a wave he was sure would drown her. I returned to my seat, hands on my lap, drawing a deep breath. Not from exhaustion, but because I could feel my body settling back into its rightful place in my life, a person who chooses for herself. In that moment, I caught a glimpse of several faces in the courtroom. The court clerk tilted her head slightly, almost like a smile. An older woman in the back, perhaps attending a different hearing, looked at me with eyes lit by something like pride. And Harold, for the first time, no longer looked at me as someone to protect, but as a legal opponent. No one was smiling now. I hadn't won yet. The battle wasn't over. But this was the moment they saw something they hadn't expected. That intellect does not age with gray hair, and dignity does not fade with time. It waits for the right moment to return stronger than anyone's belief in your weakness. When the hearing recessed, I rose slowly, not in haste, not in fear. I simply spoke to myself, a quiet vow. They tried to cast me as confused, but they are the ones who've lost their way. I'm no longer someone waiting to be rescued. I am someone who stands. And from that moment, this battle changed course. The next hearing took place on a gray morning, the clouds hanging low over the Boston sky like mourning cloth that hadn't yet been lifted. The atmosphere in the courtroom as I entered was no longer what it had been the first time. People no longer looked at me like some drifting old woman. There were glances, curious, scrutinizing, and somewhere among them, cautious. Rebecca and Evan sat at the plaintiff's table. Rebecca had her arms crossed, lips slightly pressed, her eyes avoiding mine. Evan looked around, restless, like a man waiting for a storm he thought he could sidestep. They weren't smiling. The confidence they once carried had dulled, though they still tried to hold the posture of victors, believing what they had started would eventually force me to bow. I sat down and placed my bag on the table. A worn fabric bag, not elegant, not flashy, but inside it was something quieter than any accusation and stronger than any interpretation. Harold Pierce stood, trying to reclaim his air of authority. Your Honor, he began, we believe Mrs. Hayes is deliberately constructing a misleading image. While she may be able to recite legal texts, that does not reflect her practical cognitive functioning on a daily basis. I looked at him, my expression calm. There is no law that says the elderly must be feeble, I thought. Only those who want to take someone's power away wish for that. The judge nodded. Mrs. Hayes, do you have anything further to present? I stood, pulled out the first document set from my bag. I didn't rush. I walked it to the court clerk's desk. Each page stacked cleanly, sharp as a blade, prepared in silence. These are the bank statements from both my and Thomas's accounts, spanning from 3 years ago to 6 months before he passed, I said, my voice steady, quiet, but firm. They show a total of $182,600 transferred to the accounts of Rebecca and Evan labeled as temporary loans, none of which have been repaid. There were murmurs in the room. Harold frowned. Rebecca clenched her fists. Evan shifted in his seat, his lips twitching. Here, I pointed to each line, is $20,000 to remodel their kitchen. Here is $12,600 for investment furniture. Here is $50,000 they claimed was for healthcare expenses for their child with no receipts, and several other amounts. I didn't look at Rebecca. I looked straight at the judge. Family, Your Honor, is a place of love, not an interest-free bank. Harold stepped forward, trying to interrupt. Those transactions were family arrangements, not proof of Mrs. Hayes's financial competence. I'm not finished, I said. Not loud, not harsh, but in a tone that left no room to cut in. I pulled out a small silver USB and placed it on the evidence table, and this is the rest. Rebecca leaned forward, her lips parting, as if preparing to call out the name of a ghost. Evan blinked rapidly, then sat upright, his hands clenched on his knees. This file, I said, is a recording I made in my home during one of their visits. I was present. It was my home. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state. I gave consent to record. That makes it legal. The judge gave a small nod. Play the recording. The audio played. First, the sound of a glass set down, a chair shifting, then Rebecca's voice, clear enough to chill bone. She can't manage this money, Evan. If we get her declared incompetent, the estate will fall to us. It's the only way. Evan's voice followed, raspy and low. I know, just be patient. Old people panic fast. Once she looks confused in court, it's done. $60 million, Rebecca whispered, not like a daughter, but like someone calculating the spoils. After all those years, it's ours, not hers. I stood still watching them. Evan's face turned crimson, his chest heaving like a man stripped bare in winter. Rebecca stared at the table, her lips trembling, shoulders hunched, not like a child caught in innocence, but an adult finally unable to claim it. Harold tried to speak, but his voice stumbled. This isn't what we meant, as I cut in, not looking at him but straight at Rebecca. Be silent. The truth speaks for itself. The room fell quiet. A special kind of silence, not from lack of sound, but from the weight of truth landing like a bronze bell tolling across an old church. No one argued. No one dared. The judge tilted her head, hand resting on the file. Her gaze no longer held doubt, but the cold, clear recognition of justice. Mrs. Hayes, she said, do you have any further requests? I drew a gentle breath, steady, unshaken. No. I only want the right to live my life without it being taken from me. Rebecca looked up, tears in her eyes, but not the tears of remorse. They were the tears of someone who realized she had lost the war she had started. In that moment, I didn't feel victory. I only saw a deep trench forming between two people who were once mother and daughter. A trench carved by money. A trench that time might heal or might not. But justice had entered that room unapologetic without needing to be invited. I sat down, hands on my lap, my gaze resting on the wooden table. Inside me there was no cheer, only a quiet stillness as deep as the bottom of a lake that had finally cleared. Not because I forgot the pain, but because I had faced it and did not bow. Some say justice delayed is still justice. To me, it feels more like dawn. It arrives just in time, after the night has been long enough to remind us we're still standing. And in that moment, I knew I was still fully myself, not because they allowed it, but because I reclaimed it. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the clerk's pen tapping softly against the paper. The air felt compressed, like the hush before a storm. But my hand resting on my thigh remained still, and my heart no longer trembled like it had the first morning I walked into this place. I had moved through the moment of being perceived as weak. I had stood through accusations, and now only the truth stood before everyone. The judge looked at us, her eyes sharp and cold, not with hatred, but with the stern clarity of the law. She set the file down, then lifted her head and spoke, her voice steady and deliberate. Having reviewed the evidence, testimony, and the legally submitted audio recording, she said, the court hereby dismisses the guardianship petition against Mrs. Eleanor Hayes in full. No one said anything. Not even a breath stirred the air. The room stood still like a painting locked between two moments. The judge continued, her gaze turning toward Rebecca and Evan. Your actions cannot be seen as protective. This is a case of abusing familial access for financial gain. The court issues a formal warning. Rebecca lowered her head, her fingers twisted tightly around a tissue. Evan leaned back, lips pressed tight, his eyes restless, as if hoping someone might rescue him. No one did. Not even their lawyer looked at them. He simply gathered his papers in silence, like someone sweeping up broken glass, knowing it would never fit back together. Mrs. Hayes, the judge, turned to me. The court recognizes your full capacity to manage your finances and personal life. This case is closed. I stood slowly. I did not bow. I did not smile in victory. I gave only a small nod. Thank you, Your Honor. The gavel struck 3 sharp knocks, like the sounds of a door closing on the past. People began to move. Chairs, scraped papers, rustled heels tapped against the stone floor. But I stayed still a moment longer, letting that moment settle into every breath. I hadn't defeated anyone. I had simply kept hold of myself. The courthouse hallway was wide and cold, like a winter day in Boston that refused to leave. I stepped out and paused near the granite wall, the chill seeping into my palms like a reminder freedom isn't always warm, but it is always worth it. Rebecca followed me. Evan didn't. He stood at a distance, speaking with Harold, his eyes turned away as if trying to avoid everything that had just happened in that room. My daughter stopped in front of me. She didn't speak right away. Her tears had already fallen, not childlike sobs, but heavy, murky ones like floodwater spilling over a riverbank, ugly and real. "Mom," she whispered, "I was just afraid of losing everything." Her face twisted not from sorrow for me, but from fear that the world she built in her mind had just crumbled, a world where old mothers are fragile, clueless with money, easy to guide, a world where love is traded for control. I looked at the daughter I gave birth to, looked into the eyes that once believed I was the safest place in the world, and the truth struck sharp like a gust from the Charles River, cutting through skin. "No," I said softly, my voice not bitter, just heavy. "You weren't afraid of losing everything. You were afraid of losing money." Rebecca shook her head, her voice unsteady. "That's not true." I raised my hand, signaling her to stop justifying. "If you were afraid of losing me," I said, "you would have come to hold my hand, not to court for signatures, control, and everything he left behind." Her tears slid down her chin. "Do you still want forgiveness?" she asked. I looked at my girl, not small anymore, but her soul hadn't caught up. "Forgiveness isn't a gift," I replied. "It's a path, and you have to walk it, not wait for me to lay it at your feet." Rebecca's face scrunched like someone had squeezed her heart too hard. "I was wrong," she said, the words halting. "I saw you alone. I saw the money, and I didn't know what to think." I touched her shoulder lightly, not a grip, not an embrace, just enough to say the bond is not dead, just breathing unevenly. "Fear isn't a crime," I said. "But fearing money more than losing someone who loves you, that was your first fall," she cried. But I didn't comfort her. Sometimes people need to feel the full weight of their greed to understand how far they've drifted. "From now on," I said, looking directly into her eyes, "I don't fight to keep assets. I fight to keep dignity. And if you want to come back to me, come back with your heart, not with your hand out." Rebecca stepped back slightly, as if those words forced her to see herself for the first time in years. I turned away, not hurried, not trembling, but every step I took felt like placing another stone on the road I was rebuilding, the road to freedom, self-respect, and peace. My footsteps echoed on the stone floor, steady, unhurried. I walked down the long hallway, white light from the glass windows reflecting onto the floor like a new path opening up. A light breeze came through, carrying the scent of oncoming snow mixed with old wood. I didn't look back, not because I was cold, but because if I had turned in that moment, I would have felt the ache like the first time I watched her fall while learning to walk. And the mother in me would have softened too much to hold the line I had just drawn with everything I had. Behind me, Rebecca sobbed quietly. She didn't call out to me. She didn't follow. That was the first sign she was beginning to understand. Ahead of me, the courthouse doors opened. Light and wind rushed in like a greeting for someone who had just emerged from battle, not with a trophy, but with her dignity intact. I walked forward, lightly, but each step weighed as much as a lifetime. 6 months passed like gentle waves brushing the shore before quietly receding into the sea. Not loud, not boastful, just patiently wearing stone into sand. I lived in a small cottage in Cape Cod with weathered wood shingles from the sea wind and a white porch lined with red geraniums. No city traffic, no courthouse doors opening and closing, only the cries of seagulls, the rustle of pine needles, and the ocean whispering like an old friend. Each morning I woke as the sunrise cast gold across the water, and my eyes no longer opened with worry or waiting. I set my feet on the rug, feeling the softness underfoot like a quiet kindness. I brewed Earl Grey, placed the ivory kettle on the small wooden table by the window, my own daily ritual for a new life. Watching the waves, I breathed slowly, peace rising through my chest like warm water. Sometimes it wasn't the feeling of victory, it was the relief of leaving behind what never deserved to hold you. I once owned a large house in Boston with a sweeping wooden staircase and oil paintings on the walls from the years Thomas and I believed stability was forever. Now I lived in 800 square feet of simplicity, but I didn't feel I had lost anything. I had only shed the heavy coats others draped over me over time, sacrificial mother-dependent woman shadow behind a husband. Those labels blew away, leaving just one person, Eleanor, and that was enough. I sold the big house after the trial, not because I was forced to, but because I chose to. That home was full of beautiful memories, but also of misinterpreted affection, of pain from phone calls I thought were love, but turned out to be surveillance. I decided to close that door before memories became a prison. I moved half of the money from the house sale, along with a portion of what Thomas left, into a fund supporting Elder Justice, an organization helping older adults escape financial abuse and forced guardianship. I remember signing the transfer papers. My hand didn't tremble. Not because I wasn't sentimental, but because I knew money only has value when it becomes a bridge, not a chain. "You see," I whispered to the photo of Thomas next to the vase of lavender on the table, "we can still protect the vulnerable, even as we grow old." A sea breeze stirred, and the corner of the frame seemed to shift slightly, as if he smiled. I don't believe in signs, but I do believe in beautiful coincidences, and I accepted that small gift. One afternoon in early April, Rebecca came to visit, unannounced. I saw her standing at the white wooden gate, holding a bouquet of cream tulips, her hair tousled by the wind. She didn't look like a victor or a beggar, just a daughter, tired and somehow softer, no longer trying to control anyone. I opened the door. She stayed quiet for a few seconds, as if gathering courage between the salt air and the sound of the waves. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, different from the voice that once echoed in that cold courtroom. "How are you today, Mom?" "No." "Do you need money?" "No." "Do you want help with your account?" "No." "When are you finalizing the transfer?" Just one simple question, right? And enough. I invited her in. I didn't say I forgave her. Forgiveness isn't a sentence. It's a small door that opens gradually, and the person entering must bow their head to pass through. We sat watching the sea, sipping tea, not talking much. Silence no longer felt heavy. It was like a porch roof sheltering us from an old rain.
"I'm trying to make things right," Rebecca said quietly after a long pause. "Not to get anything back, just to become the kind of daughter a mother deserves. I know that's not enough, but I'm learning." I nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I know, and I'm still here, but so are the boundaries." She nodded too, no resistance. The way she placed her hand on the teacup told me she'd learned something many adults take a lifetime to understand. Family is not a leash. It's a narrow path that leads us back to each other, and that path must be walked with self-respect, not entitlement. When Rebecca left, I stood on the porch for a while, listening to the sound of her car fade into the distance. I didn't cry. I didn't feel regret. I simply let the ocean breeze touch my cheek, and my heart felt as light as a sail when the wind is just right. I walked back inside and placed my hand on the table, feeling the warmth of the wood against my skin. On it sat my still warm teacup, an open book, and a few notes about planting more flowers in the garden. I didn't win because I was strong, I thought. I won because I wasn't afraid to be alone, because solitude isn't emptiness. It's the space where we find ourselves again. And if there's one thing life has taught me, it's this: when you're not afraid to stand alone, no one can make you kneel. Outside, the wind rustled again, and the waves kept rolling in steady and patient, needing no validation. I poured another cup of tea, opened the door to let the late afternoon light flood the room, and smiled, not because the ending was perfect, but because I had walked through something hard and still kept my heart intact. No bitterness, no sorrow, just the quiet knowing that what's gone was never worth keeping, and what remains is something no one can ever take. And that, I think, is enough for one life.